When it comes to buying a new watch, micro brands have a lot to offer, and I think this Selton has a lot to offer. It has a unique design to it. It has some interesting materials. It's well made. It is reasonably priced, but has it turned out to be the right watch for me? Hello, you're watching James. My name's James. You're watching me. And I am talking about watches, and this Selton is this watch that I was very excited about when I pressed that buy it now button. I was excited because I thought it looked amazing, but I was most excited because of the details surrounding this watch. The details that I could see in those pictures and on the videos that I'd seen about it that looked so good. And I like watches that have details. I like watches that have a wow factor, and this Selton certainly seems to have details and wow factor to it. And this one, when I ordered it, it was a pre-order. This is kind of one of those watches that he sort of takes a number of orders, and when he reaches the right amount of orders, he places that order, he has them made and has them shipped. So it can take a little while between pressing buy it now and receiving that watch, and it will vary a little bit depending on where you place that order. For me, it took under 6 months, and for me, when I purchased this one, I got it at a small discount. That's why you would have seen that sponsored icon pop up. It's because I reached out to Selton. I told him that I was really keen to own this watch, and he offered me a small discount. I did pay the majority of the price of the watch, but because I got that discount, I've put that sponsored icon up there, and I'm also, of course, going to leave a link directly to the Selton website. And when you look at that website, you're going to see there's a couple of different variations and options to choose from. Firstly, dials. You can go for that meteorite dial like I chose, but he also has an aventurine style dial, and that seems to be quite popular recently. But there's also a choice of different handsets. There's a real vintage sort of style, and then there's the handset that I chose, which is probably a little bit more of a traditional sort of modern style of hands. And if you buy this one, you can buy it with or without a bracelet, but with the bracelet, the style that I chose, it cost $699 US. And for $699 US, you're getting a fair amount for that money. You're getting a watch with a high beat 9132 Miyota movement, of course that natural meteorite dial, a heat blued second hand, sapphire crystal with AR coating, and this watch really has a great set of dimensions because the case itself is 40.1 millimeters. The height of the watch is 13.1 millimeters. The lug to lug is 47.2 millimeters. The lug width has a nice standard 20 millimeters, but if you have it on the bracelet, you'll see there's a dramatic taper down to the clasp of 16 millimeters, and it weighs, set to my 17 centimeter wrists, 132 grams. And you'll see on my 17 centimeter wrist that these dimensions sit perfectly. And it does sit a tiny little bit tall, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. I don't think this is a tall watch, but possibly this style of watch may affect your opinion about this a little bit. But other than that, I think this sizing of watch, this 40 millimeter by around about 47 millimeter lug to lug, is a perfect fit to my wrist. But of course, I bought this watch for the looks of it, for that dial. So let's look a little bit closer at that lovely sliver of meteorite, because that is unique to this specific watch, because every piece of meteorite is going to be a little bit different. And this one is really interesting because I really like how in the darker environments, it has a sort of semi-muted look, but then when you stick it out into the sun, it really sparkles. Looking down also at that day-night indicator, it's almost like a 24-hour dial that spins around slowly. You'll see there are two other small discs. Both of those, the lighter and the darker, is cut out of small pieces of meteorite. And it also gives us a little bit of a 3D effect of how it sits there, down there at the 6 o'clock, which I really do like. And you'll see those dark blue background there, which is nice, and those stars are also polished. That Selton logo is applied, and I just do like how it looks. I like that sort of vintage element to that Selton logo. There's obviously a lot of details going on with this watch, but I think there's a lot of thought gone behind those details too, and that is shown off a lot even in this applied logo, because when you look at the logo, you can see that they've thought out the specific details of it. You can see that when you look under it under a macro lens, that there is a polished chamfered edge, there's brushing on it. So even the logo itself is well made, detailed and thought out. Now there are two sets of hands you can choose for this watch as I showed you earlier, but I chose these ones because, well, I prefer them. And they're really very nice. They're all brushed with some lume in the middle of them, and you'll see that second hand is actually heat treated blue, which is always a nice sort of thing to have on a watch. But what I like about it with this particular watch is how that blue looks onto that nice grey background with that meteorite dial. And when you shift this watch to a more angled shot, it shows you actually how deep the applied markers are. In fact, they're probably the most 3D markers I have ever seen, the most tall markers that I have ever seen, raising off that chapter ring, which I actually really like. And they're polished so they add to that sort of sparkle when they do hit the sun. And then you turn the lights off and you see the jewel lume, and it is particularly good. It is actually better than I expected for a watch of this type of style. Normally this style, this sort of more sort of dressy style, generally lasts okay, but this one has been really quite impressive. And there must be a fair amount of AR coating put on the underside of this flat sapphire crystal, because in lots of different angles when looking down at this dial, that crystal just disappears. Integrating into that flat piece of sapphire crystal is that vertically brushed angled solid chapter ring, which sort of falls away from that crystal really well. And what you'll see just underneath that is a little band of polish, which I think works really well, having that brushed and then polished, and then back onto some brushing onto the tops of those lugs and the side case. There is the polished chamfer edge, which gives a little bit of something as well, breaking up that polished, and there's an unguarded sign crown. Now this watch is powered by the Miyota 9132 automatic high beat movement, but being that Miyota movement, it also has manual winding and hacking. And what you may find, or at least what I've found with this particular movement when you're trying to wind it up with this crown, well, that crown tends to be a little bit small, making that hand winding experience just a little bit harder than I've found with other watches. But flipping this watch over, you're going to see there is a see-through case back showing off that high beat Miyota. But what you're actually going to notice straight away is that very cool customized full-size rotor. Something that I haven't really seen before, and it's something that really stands out. But something that stands out to me more is the details of how that case back is attached to the case. I just like the design decisions of how that sort of looks, and I think that's quite a nice feature too. But I want to move on to the bracelet now, because this is something that really affects how this watch feels on wrist. It really gives this watch a almost delicate feel, and that is partly because of that dramatic taper from 20 down to 16, but it's also because there's so much movement and it sits on wrist really nice, and probably partly because of the look as well. It has those sort of brushed sort of elements to it with those polished center links, which give you a little bit of a dressy sort of feel, but not too much of a dressy feel. This does have a pin and collar system, which is probably not my favorite system. It is a system that I enjoy having on a watch once it has been sized, but I don't really enjoy the sizing sort of feel or sort of experience. And this one I struggled with a little bit, and this may well be user error, I will admit to that, which is why I end up putting a scratch on the bracelet. And unfortunately, it's in a spot where I can't switch out the link either, which is quite disappointing, but that's on me, not on this particular watch. Now it has one of those butterfly clasps that only goes on the wrist one way because there is an overlapping element to it with that Sultan logo. I do find sometimes it is a little bit tricky to put it on, and when I say a little bit tricky, I don't mean hard at all. It just means you just need to have a tiny little bit of concentration to ensure that they click on properly so that they don't sort of overlap themselves, as you can see there. Not a hard thing, just something you need to be aware of when you put the watch on, that you actually need to pay a tiny little bit of attention versus just clicking it on like some other watches. And that brings me to, what do I like about this watch? What don't I like about this watch, and what would I change? And I'm going to say there's a lot about this watch that I like. I like the thought behind the design, the thought behind the quality of this watch. There is definitely thought put into this particular watch. And you can see that through how well it is made, and I really enjoy that quality aspect of this watch. You can see that through the design of this watch, and it is a great design. I think it is a really lovely looking watch, and you can see about it with the choices of materials, and this taper of the bracelet, and the design of the rotor on the back, and the depth on the dial. There are so many positives to this watch that I enjoyed. It is a watch that really makes me look at it, think about it, have it on wrist, and get absorbed in that dial. But there's a couple of things I probably don't love about it. Because of that extra depth on that dial, allowing those details and those 3D effects that I actually love, it does mean this watch is a little bit high on wrist. Now I'm going to say it's not high on wrist compared to normal sort of Garda watches or dive watches, but because this sort of feels more like a dressy kind of everyday watch, it possibly sits a little bit tall for that style. Not for a watch, but possibly that style. The pin and collar system on the bracelet as well, I understand why they've used it because it is quite a delicate bracelet. Having screws in there would probably be almost impossible, but I struggled a little bit with them. Possibly a better version of a pin and collar system might be better. And as easy as it is realistically to close that butterfly clasp, I do find that I do have to pay a little bit of attention when I'm doing it because of the design of it. And also that crown. It looks good. It's perfectly okay to use, but when you do manually wind that movement, you do notice that it feels just a tiny little bit small in hand, which pretty much covers off the things that I'd like to change about this watch. It would be nice to bring it down a little bit, sit down onto wrist just a touch more, because I think that would almost complete the experience of wearing this watch if it was just a touch thinner on wrist. Changing that bracelet, although I like it so much, I think might be a little bit better as well. Just changing how it's put together, maybe changing the clasp a little bit, maybe having one of those slightly smaller but more conventional style clasps, perhaps similar to something that I've experienced like on Oris before. It might take away from the dressy element of this watch a little bit, but perhaps maybe make the experience about on wrist a little bit better. But for $749 US, is it worth purchasing? Well, I'm going to say that this watch is super well made, super detailed, super interesting with some great materials. With that movement as well, I think the pricing is about right, especially for the design of this watch. There aren't many watches you can get out there for this sort of money that have this many interesting elements to it, that are this sort of design. It is unique, it is well made, it is well thought out. But in my own collection, I've found that I've ended up picking this watch up and looking at it more than I've actually ended up wearing it. And I'm not exactly sure why that has been the case. Possibly because of the design of it is possibly doesn't fit in with my lifestyle as much as I would have thought. Possibly because it sits a little bit high on wrist, so when I've worn it, I've sort of had a slight mix of experiences with it. It feels like I should be wearing this one with the looks when I go out to dinner, but from the feel on wrist, maybe I should be wearing it every day. So it ends up feeling a little bit mixed on my wrist. But that doesn't stop me recommending this one because it is a beautiful watch. It is certainly something interesting as well, but in my own personal collection, I've found that it is the one that I tend to be drawn towards to pick up, to look at, to think about and go, wow, look at those details. But then I end up putting it back down again and I end up wearing another watch. That is my own personal experience, however. It's not me saying that this is not a watch that should be worn, because it should be worn. It is a beautiful watch to have, and it would be fitting into many collections out there. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Maybe you can check these videos out next.